Welcome to this Tuesday on Crypt. Oh my God, the markets are whatever they are, and I want to get into what I'm going to call Stablecoin Week, where I go through a few different protocols leveraging stablecoins and their concepts to provide yield through a variety of different mechanisms. I'll try to keep it under 5 minutes per protocol, but just remember, just because issuers can't share yield doesn't mean that protocols can't. Let's dive in. Now, today I want to start with USDAI, and I'm going to lay this out first because I am a biased person. This protocol is co-founded by a very good friend of mine, David Choi, and his colleague Connor. They've been crushing it. It did start out as a lending protocol around NFTs, so there was a fairly organic morph as they sought where does yield come from and how do blockchains really benefit from it. Now, the idea here is pretty basic. They looked at the growing landscape of data centers, the increased demand around GPUs for AI, and they said, hey, is there a way to build a lending market and a stablecoin directly related to this burgeoning industry? Now, with current APR at 8.6, expected to go up to 11, and total value locked at 111 million real dollars right now, over 10,000 users, the protocol is still in its inception, but looking pretty good. The core of this all is what they're calling Infra-Fi, infrastructure finance. And you can see that it's pretty straightforward. They want to help people finance increasing infrastructure while also protocolizing the process, allowing it to automate and grow at scale. In their own words, they say right here, USDAI, the petrodollar for the AGI future. It's a nice catchline and a very interesting concept. As you begin to dive into USDI, they have this thing that they are calling stackable DeFi primitives. The Lego block attitude has been long employed to describe DeFi and its composability. Now, structured finance, as they say, is the process of abstraction, utilizing layers of liquidity mechanisms to achieve full risk transfer, like thermodynamics, but for finance, only achievable on-chain through stackable, composable DeFi primitives. USDAI and the corresponding token representations, USDAI and staked USDAI, represent the latest progression from the legacy MetaStreet architecture and ecosystem around the on-chain structured credit products. This happens through three mechanisms, which is Caliber, how they actually back the assets and bring them on chain, through Filo, the programmatic way that they manage this risk and allow risk curation to scale, and of course QEV, which is a system for liquidity and redemption. Now, Caliber is the beginning of this whole concept. It is their structure for a generalized framework for off-chain hard assets. In their case, they are using GPUs. What they are leaning on is this concept from the Uniform Commercial Code UCC Section 7, which is called bailment. Bailment is something that comes out of the commodities ecosystem, and it is literally when a commodities owner leases out their commodities for the sake of someone else's actions. These are usually short term, and of course they break this down into ownership, enforcement, liquidity, insurance, high compatibility, default processes. These are all extremely essential in building out this ecosystem for the lending and borrowing of these GPUs. The key parties are the borrower, the tokenized agent, which is Caliber, the data center that stores these GPUs, and of course, the lender that provides the capital to the borrower. If you want to hop into this, by all means do, but in a nutshell, if you have a bunch of GPUs sitting inside of a warehouse, and a warehouse is specific to the requirements on commodities, well, hey, you can go and lend through USDAI. You can set up what is called a special purpose vehicle. Think of it as like a mini company wrapper. You can put those GPUs inside, not physically, but legally speaking. And what this SPV does is it protects everybody inside the protocol from me, the borrower. In case my company goes under, my GPU scaling business, the actual hardware that I've lent to this SPV can be protected from the Chapter 11. So the protocol now owns these borrowed assets inside of this SPV. That SPV is what gets tokenized. Let's say I have 100 GPUs and I lend 10 of them to this SPV. I put them inside, it gets tokenized. Now within the system, I have 10 GPUs against which I can borrow stable coins. So if I want to scale to 110, I lend those 10, I borrow more money, I add 10 more, we scale up. Every 30 days, I need to repay my loan or we get into the position of a default. If I fail to pay my loan on that 30-day period, that NFT that represents those 10 units and is legally enforceable goes off to auction. This is an opportunity for other parties to bid on those 10 GPUs. Now, they can either take that NFT, they can reborrow against it, they can use it as a financial mechanism, likely the case, or they could go through court orders to show up and physically seize those 10 GPUs. This is all backed, and we are now beginning to see the legal system bleeding into true on-chain finance. It's really exciting, and this is what LexNode talks about, Gabe Shapiro, with on-chain legal processes, something that is beginning to take form and will impact the robustness of the mechanisms that we can build between real-world assets existing in the real world and their on-chain representations. Now, of course, with any sort of lending borrowing, you have to prevent cascading effects. We can't have runaway events that either suck all of the liquidity out of the system or just cause this kind of bankruptcy cascade, right? We need to make sure that the pistons that operate the machine stay in an equal cadence. If any of those get out of whack, the machine might go bonkers and explode. So they're doing this through a tranched or a tiered redemption mechanism. Basically, there are first loss curators, people that lose their money first, taking on greater risk, but in order to do so, they earn a higher yield. These positions are less liquid because they are that protective buffer, but of course, incentivized by that higher rate of return. Then you have the USDAI holders. You put in $1, you get USDAI, you can stake that USDAI and earn the yield coming from these loan repayments. They act as the secondary tier. They're highly liquid, they're diversified across all loans, and they earn yield passively from USDAI. If you want to learn more about the underwriting processes and standards, definitely hop in here. Now, one thing to note is if there is the case of a default and any auction participant gets in there, they can actually gain custody of that NFT and begin to borrow against it as if they own the GPUs themselves. This will obviously get more complicated if the data provider shuts down entirely and that NFT holder will have to take physical custody. But at the very end, we have a well thought out redemption mechanism. Remember, if people all try to redeem these NFT claims at the same time, the liquidity in the system will crunch and it will cause a problem. So the way they've handled this is to actually make a queue where only so much redemption is capable within each epoch or block per chain. What happens here is that they use those epochs and that liquidity drip to create another auction mechanism. For anyone that wants to prioritize that loan, they can take less money in order to get out faster. And of course, this goes back and forth. We can see here through the diagram that the flow looks like this. Borrower repays the loans monthly. The lender, number of depositors, which obviously could be many, goes into the redemption queue. A basic redemption might be a reinvest where the money comes out. They say, hey, you've been paid. Let's automate that loan back to the staking action. Now, if it defaults, provides various bids, well, then we get to the QEV auction. And when that auction is redeemed, we have to get to the allocated liquidity. What they are calling this is smoothing proportions. And what gets to be rather fun about this is that there's actually market-driven liquidation unlock. So rather than rigid queue lockups, QEV enables structured priority bidding through epoch-based auctions. So one, the staker enters a redemption queue, receiving amortized liquidity over time. Users bid for priority access to unlock liquidity faster. Now, what's fun about this is bids scale queue movement proportionally, avoiding all or nothing distribution events. Passive stakers receive rewards through bribe redistribution. This is very similar to the V-curve model. And all bids are done privately through ZK proofs to avoid any sort of block reorg, which would be MEV or QEV. Now, winning bidders move up the queue while non-bidders remain in amortized scheduling. What this ends up doing is actually creating a market where you could potentially win a bid for increased liquidity. And if somebody wants that, it will likely eventually be wrapped in its own token. So people participating in the liquidity market could sell these positions in the exit queue to other borrowers. If someone wants that money right now and they just don't care, they might pay a premium for it. They could either lose some of that redemption capital or be able to pay a premium at the moment for an NFT version of this exit queue prioritization. So there's markets within markets here, and we start to see that this creates a very robust, very real financial product that sits on chain and represents, like the petrodollar represented oil, GPUs in an AI factory. And in the way that Bitcoin miners kind of paved the path for how do we handle these giant data centers and how do we handle their energy systems and their load balancing, etc., Bitcoin miners are the precursor to AI GPU data centers. In fact, many, if not almost all at this point, of the majorly publicly traded Bitcoin miners now switch and vacillate between mining Bitcoin or providing compute to AI, depending on which grosses them the most at any given point of time. So we are looking at the internet foundationally changing, where these data centers are becoming increasingly important. We have data centers where information is stored, and that's pretty cold, right? That can be called and pulled upon at any point in time. But these new GPUs for LLMs, for AI, these are going to be very hot. These are going to be pinged two ways, right? People will be constantly querying them, and those queries will have to respond back to the user. This constant dialogue is less like a library and more like a town square. That's kind of what I mean when I say hot versus cold. And USDAI looks to protocolize the financial assets around this marketplace. What we are seeing here is what would be traditional banking structure. You would generally go to a bank to take out a loan against your business with collateral. This has happened traditionally for years and years and years with intermediaries sitting in the middle and collecting that yield for the banks themselves. Now we have smart contracts that can automate this with, instead of the bank being the capital provider, and remember, banks get that capital from the people who store within them. That's where the savings account APY comes from. We can now have users give their cash directly to the protocol so that it can borrow and lend on their behalf. And since the protocol's code doesn't have families and licensed intermediaries sitting in the middle to handle risk mitigation, it can turn around and share those yields with all the participants. So while the Genius Act says that issuers cannot take a dollar, buy a T-bill, and share that yield with stablecoin holders, that's what the banks are afraid of, we can see that the protocols can take these stablecoins, they can put them to work in a variety of ways, and they can return that yield. In this way, the banks are absolutely fucked, and stablecoin proliferation will happen slowly but surely. We're seeing protocols acting as banks with minimal teams required to maintain their uptime, and just as we've seen with Tether, with Pump.Fund, there will be very small teams generating massively outsized returns per employee. It is a new age, it is a new company format, and as we go through this shift towards the future of money, where money and value come on the internet in the same way data did in the past 3 decades, we now enter the new phase of a purely digitized financial world. With that being said, USDAI has closed some amazing venture capital partners. They have the backing and the following of some of the greater minds. My buddy David is one of the more interesting thinkers of on-chain assets and how they can interact with the real world. So this is something to follow. They did fill up their first 100 million in deposits, so they've kind of capped it as we stand right now, but they're eager to unlock that and to move to the next phase. If you're curious about the growth in AI and the cross sections of cryptocurrency, then USDAI is a perfect place to dive in. I find their docs to be quite clear, and I learned a lot. I didn't know anything about Baylor contracts, and that's kind of a far out concept. That's how they're bringing these real world assets on chains as commodities, not securities, and commodities trade. They have the velocity of money. They take advantage of the faster block times and what can be achieved with the scale, the speed, and the security of crypto. So it's a really exciting project. Tune in. Now, guys, I will be back tomorrow with a different stablecoin platform to look at each day this week, just kind of how the banks are fucked and what the industry is doing to create a better, more egalitarian, more free to access ecosystem for the future of money. With that being said, don't overlever, stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow.